Welcome to another episode of SJS Recommends. Today we are gonna talk about Kichu Yoshida's heroic Purgatory from 1970. This time I'm not gonna do a plot synopsis, as I have no clue what the plot is, even though I've seen the film 3 times. But I own it in this beautiful Arrow Academy box set. This is actually the American version, so it doesn't have the rating logo, so it looks a bit nicer. And this box set also has his film Aerospace Massacre, which is also a masterpiece, and then it has a film called Coup which isn't as good as Aerospace Massacre and Heroic Purgatory, but still a good film. So these 3 films are kind of loosely called like a Love and Anarchism trilogy. So this is actually aesthetically my favorite box set that I have. I absolutely adore how this box set looks. Like pink and purple are my favorite colors. This is actually a very queer looking box set for some reason. And then I'll show the booklet quickly. So it's a very hefty booklet with, I think, 3 essays, and then there are these nice shots from the films and stuff. So yeah, good stuff. And then the films. So we have, like, these 2 are for Aerospace Massacre, as it has the theatrical version in one, and then the director's cut in another one. And we are gonna talk about this film in the podcast someday in the future, and we are gonna do the longer director's cut when we do it. And then this one has Heroic Purgatory and Coup d'etat in the same one. But yeah, and
Really nice.
and the covers are just shots from the films, so in these pretty interesting colors. So, but Yoshida was one of the main names of the Japanese New Wave, and he was in particular part of the ATG or Art Theater Guild studio for these Japanese New Wave films, just like people like Akio Ishijoji. So his films are extremely difficult. They are very radical and brutalist in terms of the aesthetic, but we'll talk more about that later. His films are very political, very free-flowing, and they are definitely kind of fully up to the interpretation of the viewer. So I think even Yoshida himself has said that he wants the viewers to have their own takes on the film, and he is in trying to say something extremely particular with his films. So I think that makes the analysis a bit easier, even though obviously it's one of the most difficult films I've ever seen. But like I said in the beginning, I've seen this film 3 times, and it's one of my absolute favorite films of all time, even though I'm not sure I can explain why it is that. I think it's the aesthetic just speaks to me so much. It's completely unique and beautiful in that brutalist way. It's like going into a really weird art gallery for 2 hours and looking at very weird paintings and very kind of even a creepy mood and everything there. It has a beautiful score as well, very haunting score. And yeah, and I've seen 10 Yoshida films, and this one is the most difficult. His earlier stuff in the early 60s, mid 60s is a bit more kind of quote unquote more normal type of films, even though they are still like new wave films, but they make more sense than this and Aerospace Massacre, because this film is truly like almost completely incomprehensible. Like it doesn't really make much sense, but that's not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I love these types of films that I don't necessarily understand, but the fact that I don't understand them makes them endlessly fascinating to me, and I can enjoy a film purely based on the beautiful aesthetics and stuff, as I'm a lover of painting as well. But I think it would be very hard to recommend this film to other people because it's so kind of off-putting, so weird and radical and brutal. So I think you need to be a very open-minded person to like a film like this, and I think you have to have quite a lot of background in art house cinema before you tackle something like this. I wouldn't go straight from Christopher Nolan to this film. I think you need to have seen quite a few like difficult films before this, preferably. But I guess there are sometimes you see in Letterboxd like 13-year-olds who already watch Bellatar and Tarkovsky films and love them. So there are those prodigy type of people who can enjoy this type of stuff like immediately. But I think for most people it will be very hard to get into. But Yoshida was someone who kind of blew me away immediately. But before I get into Yoshida, I already had like several years of art house experience. But anyway, now I'll shut up for a bit and let Altaz tell us like what did he think of this film.
Yeah. So, like you said, this is, for me, this is the most challenging film I have ever seen. And it was, everything you're saying is, that's what I felt. I was like, this is going to the very bounds of what can you call it cinema. The whole time I was even watching it, I was like, which realm are we in? Because this is one of those things that's not about categories. It's pure artistic expression, and that is, has to be commended, to do that, to kind of, to take it there. It's hard to even comprehend that this, his mind as a person, because you're like, for him to conceptualize, and then he actually had to picturize, and then on top of that, the actors. I constantly wondered. I wonder, because I don't have acting experience, but just, okay, doing some acting in high school and all that stuff. I used to enjoy acting, and in that, you would always have to ask, well, what's the character's motivation? What's the motivation here? That kind of thing. And I was like, how were the actors described what is going on? What's the scene? What is my character doing? Who is my character? Uh, like you said, and so it's an impossible to pin down type film, because it doesn't have a point of reference anywhere, even in the character itself, in the character arcs, in the flows, that there are character arcs, but the way it's just constructed together, it's yeah, it's an absolutely near, like, impossible film in a way to, if you're going to go with this idea of like, it's got to make sense, it's got to do this, you really just have to journey and observe and feel. And like you said, for that reason, this is not going to be something that you can turn around and say, oh, I recommend this film, this is a great film, because I felt like majority of the people you recommend this to will turn around and say, why did you do that to me? Or with, within the first 5 minutes would say, this is absolutely ridiculous, this is bonkers, I'm not watching this. And they might even get angry at you and say, there's no way that you think there's anything of value in here. And uh, as you said, this is where you're going into realms where art is pushing boundaries, like in modern art, postmodern art, and stuff like that. There's a breaking down of form and function and narrative and time and all kinds of things. Uh, but it's an extremely worthwhile experience. I absolutely commend you for seeing that 3 times already, which is just unbelievable to me. But I also feel like it's something that I would want to visit periodically because of what it does. It's almost like breaking everything, and in a way helps you understand other kinds of film better by watching something like this, because you don't realize what other film is doing until you it's taken away, and then you realize, oh, okay, uh, what are the conventions that people follow.
Yeah, one thing I'll say now is that I don't think there will be a spoiler-free and like spoiler discussion in this
Yeah,
episode, as there's nothing to spoil. It would be like, don't give me spoilers about Vincent Van Gogh painting or something like
yeah,
that. I
yeah.
would say, because it's more like a almost like a painting film, and I would say that this is almost like a free jazz, but as a film.
Mm,
So it's just absolutely chaotic and free flowing and insane, but at the same time it feels very ordered in a way that it, like when
mm,
you see how the shots transition from each other to the next one. It all makes kind of sense, like visually, and it looks amazing in that way. So, like from an aesthetic point of view, it makes sense how it flows forward. And I would say that with this film, it could be good to take Tarkovsky's advice on how to watch films, that you should let yourself go and feel the film and not overanalyze the film, because obviously with something as ridiculous and different and weird as this, it's better to try to let yourself go with the visuals and stuff and not be like too like nitpicky and stuff like that, and focus on every single detail in a very analytical way, but rather just try to enjoy the weird experience.
Yeah.
But it's like really weird that this like in my like top 20 films of all time. Like I really don't know like exactly why that is, but I just get something like so profound from this film and many films that are fairly similar. Like there are some like Peter Greenaway films that are like painting after painting after painting. Doesn't really make sense, but I just love the experience. And we are gonna talk about Fellini's Satyricon at some point in the podcast, and that's very much a film like this as well, that it doesn't really have a coherent narrative or anything, but just aesthetic beauty. And as the style is so brilliant and different, the style kind of becomes substance. Yeah. So, but yeah, it's kind of weird to start with this as your first Yoshida film. I started with Eros Plus Massacre, which is like in many ways very similar film to Heroic Purgatory, but it's a bit more plot driven and a bit more clear than this. So, but I wanted to start with this one as it is my favorite, and also as Eros Plus Massacre is 3.5 hours long, so I thought that we would start with a 2-hour film, but we will do Eros Plus Massacre at some point. Like I said, but people who are really into painting and who are into experimental cinema, abstract cinema, experimental art, who like films that aren't narrative driven but are aesthetic driven, mood driven films, I think I could give a slight recommendation of this film to people like that. But I will still say that even if you like that type of stuff, you might not enjoy this film as it is so difficult. But Yoshida is still like a very important artist and a very highly rated artist in the Japanese new wave scene, especially by like again critics who have the access to Japanese new wave, because obviously in the West we have pretty poor accessibility to lots of the Japanese new wave films, so many people haven't been able to see these films. But again, David Desser, for example, does introductions to these films on these discs, and I think he's a big fan of these films. And I think many cinephiles who I've seen online who have watched these films think that these are really great stuff. But yeah, even that said, it's still hard to recommend these to people, and we'll see what Tony thinks of these. He said that he's gonna watch it sometime soon. It's really hard to say, because again, I think Tony has seen like a similar film to this, as there really aren't films that are similar to this. Even like the other Japanese new wave directors, I'm like pretty well versed in that period, because it's one of my favorite movements in cinema, if not my favorite. So there are some directors who have fairly similar style, like again the Buddhist trilogy that is also released by Arrow. It's by Akio Jisoshi. So that stuff is like pretty similar to this. And then there's this director called Suchi Terayama, who I often shout out on my channel, and he also has a bit of this type of stuff, but still Yoshida just stands out on his own with a very unique style. And I forgot to mention in the introduction too that he sadly passed away like a couple of years ago. I think it was late 2022, but he lived a very long life, and I think later on his life he didn't make films anymore. I think he worked in 60s, 70s, 80s, and maybe 90s, but not much in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously we'll ditch any kind of notion that we're going to be able to have a discussion that's not going to sound very pedantic or even sound not sound snobby in some ways, because it's just goes with the territory. uh, but I can totally see 100% why this would be in your top 20, because there are two elements, uh, at least two elements, where you could look at any work of art. There's convention, and then there is expanding the boundary. So here's a film that is, it's like creating dimensionality in the film. Like you're going through, it's almost, it feels like an alternate dimension, or you are jumping dimensions. And I can understand to a certain extent, because if you are in the eye of a tornado, for example, so circularity, right? If you say there's a cycle, not even circularity, but cyclicality, a cycle. So the idea of the cycle is there, that no matter what happens, there's this cycle nature to um, movements, human nature, power, political power, violence, uh, revolution, and all that. There's no point that there's a fixed point. And so this film is made from a premise. The premise is there is no fixed point. So there is no linear way to look at beginning, middle, after, late stage, all this. It's a cycle. It's and in a way, it's almost like a weather system, like a tornado. It's as it goes, it breeds more. As it goes, it breeds more. As it goes, it breeds more. Now, obviously, this sounds completely like nonsense to anyone watching it, what I'm saying, because it's like, unless you watch the film, there's no conventional way to talk about. I mean, there's some limited conventional way we can talk about, okay, there is a kind of sub story going on, but the story is more about symbolism than it is about an actual character per se. But starting with the mere fact that to capture that as a film, because you still do experience it like a film, which is really amazing. Because why would you, is it just the medium that makes it feel like it's still a film? I don't know, I can't answer that question, but you can see that this is a thing always in motion and always happening on multiple dimensions. Some are reality, some are alternate reality, some are mirror reality. And it's crazy. It's absolutely bonkers. It's absolutely crazy, and you have to applaud it. And you have to, yes. I mean, I haven't really sat there and thought about my rankings of films or top films or all that, but I can 100% would not be shocked by anyone sitting there putting this in their top 20 or even in their top 10. Because it's an absolute work of brilliance, and I don't know how you can create an experience that's, it's like both has, it's intellectual, it's spiritual, and there's a lot of feeling and humanity there, all tied in one, where one is not clear. It's not, I'm going in an intellectual odyssey, or I'm going in a spiritual odyssey, or I'm going in an emotional humanistic odyssey. It's just all together and all at once. uh, it, it's an experience, and you have to be patient as well, yeah, because even for me, it's that there's a lot that kind of becomes, reveals itself later on in the film. So in that way, it does have some convention in there, that there is a revelation that's happening slowly, but you have to keep with it, and keeping with it can at times be like challenging on any person's mind, because they're like, what is going on? As soon as you think you've pinned something, you're somewhere else. Then you think you pinned something, then you're somewhere else, and you're like, what exactly is going on? And that's what you have to just keep asking yourself, what's going on? What's going on? Or what do I see? What do I feel? what's this aesthetic doing for me? What is it? I mean, it's something else. It's otherworldly. This film.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned free jazz before, but I feel like maybe this film has more reference points in other art forms like
Mm,
music, like weird experimental industrial music, free jazz. Like I was just thinking that if you mood at this film when you were watching it and put like the Cecil Taylor album that
mm,
we talked about a couple of months ago and watch it that way, I think it would be a good soundtrack to these and
yes.
albums like that, or some like late John Coltrane albums that we are probably going to talk about on the podcast at some point. So yeah, that would be pretty crazy. But I was also thinking that I think we should talk about a bit of the context of the time in general, the political time, as it came out in 1970, which was obviously kind of very radically changing time, because in the late 60s you had the hippie movement, the start of second wave of feminism. In France you had the 68 student riots. There was lots of political radicalism of many different types, and lots of these very important like French philosophers and other philosophers of that time that had very radical ideas and politics. Like in the 60s, for example, Herbert Marcuse's One Dimensional Man came out, which was very radical about capitalism and our consciousness and about things like that. And I think it's important to set that kind of context to this, because this film again is a very political film. And I think a couple of like themes that I wrote down on my notes was one of that was that kind of Japanese society and the disillusionment of people. And this still, even though it's 1970, it still has that kind of post-war identity crisis of Japan. I think that again people aren't really sure how to move forward. They
Mm,
are still struggling with past traditions, and they struggle with these combating ideologies, different ideologies, and how to execute them, how to think about them. And there's this kind of again identity crisis both in a micro and macro level. Obviously, these people, you can see that there's lots of kind of psychological turmoil in these
mm,
characters that aren't really characters necessarily, but are like again people, and we see them and in these crazy shots and stuff. So there's lots of kind of psychological stuff, both again societally and again in the micro level of these characters and how they talk. And there's even they say that are men becoming homosexuals to be more radical and free and things like that.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
mean, and I don't think he means that as an
mm,
insult or stuff, but I think it's just
yeah,
the time that people were trying to be politically radical, but then they maybe in certain
yeah,
kind of self-centered way become radical in their identities and in their personhood and what they were
mhm,
as people, rather than bringing communism to the world or
mhm,
anarchism to the world. So that's an
yeah,
interesting battle between individual and the more the society, and kind of individualism versus community and things like that. So I think those themes are like very prevalent in this film, and that's something that I think it's the one thing that's a bit more easy to read about this film.
I find that really fascinating that you are thinking in terms of the political and what's happening at the time. And definitely, I think obviously that's super important. Uh, when I was watching the film, all I could do is, well, because just like when you read a book, there's introductions and stuff like that. So obviously, on this disc, there's an intro by Yoshida. There's an intro by who's the other person?
David
Uh,
Tesser,
yeah, David Desert.
who's a
I
Japanese.
didn't watch the I didn't watch the intros. I watched the film first, just like I'll read the book and read the like intro after, because I want to be thrown in. I don't even though I'll be confused and frustrated and stuff. I kind of like that. Uh, and so what I was focusing on a lot was the family unit, which I thought was very interesting. I'm like, obviously this is a very political film. Obviously it's about the times, but I couldn't help but really get into the layer or the dimension of the family unit, because there was a lot of interesting thing going on with the family unit, right? There's this loose narrative of Ayu, who's like this lost girl. Like, I mean, obviously they're like bizarre scenarios. This girl walks into a house, you're my mom, you're my dad. They don't seem to be her parents, but well, we're not doing spoilers, but maybe they were. So it's a question. Doesn't mean they were or they weren't, but there's a question by the end. You say, "Oh, were they?" Um, because there's this whole multi-dimensional thing. There's this whole doppelganger thing going, mirror thing going. So, and then there's this really I felt most connected to the that girl who's lost amongst the parents or in search of the parents and very focused on searching for the father. Why is she searching for the father? Obviously, in some ways, that is a bit answered because, okay, this is such a difficult movie to talk about because it's complex. So it's like you can talk about it, but it's like confusing because you realize that this child is not just this child, it's every child in the revolution. So on a family level, this confusion, because while the parents go out and fight these battles for the future, the child is lost, the child is traumatized, the child is looking for love, the child is looking for acceptance. And so you can sit there and look at what that child represents at the individual level, the societal level, like you're saying, and the political level. Because like you're saying, there are all these movements going on and they're all fighting for this revolution and all this change, and something is being lost in the process of that. And what's that thing? And that thing is just kind of walking around in a sense of purgatory. So there's all kinds of different purgatory, and I don't just mean in a biblical sense, because obviously I've always been interested in religions, like in philosophies of the East as well. So I could see the purgatory sense in the more Buddhist sense, maybe in Shintoism, but I don't know Shintoism that well. So there's all these kinds of purgatory that's in there. Everyone's kind of stuck in this realm where they can't figure out which way is light, which way is dark. And then obviously, if you watch the film, you'll see that aesthetically there's this constant contrast going on. And even this child, you'll see there'll be little scenes where there's like white and black, and then the child will move from white to black, back to white, back to black. And it's mirroring this: I'm lost. I don't know what's right, what's wrong. And that's just one thing that a thread. I think everyone has to find a thread that you follow, because, and then you'll see the other threads. But the tapestry is way too complex to really articulate like we're trying to do. I feel like it's always you're gonna end up in a circle, and then you're gonna confuse yourself, and then you'll start jumping, and you'll say, well, what about this? And will this might be as all over the place as the film is, or it seems to be.
And you can tie that family unit discussion to the political and identity themes that I mentioned before. You talked about that, because again, this whole society seems very fragmentary, where there are all of these different things clashing against each other. There isn't like any cohesion in there, neither in the family unit, but not in the society either, and not in these relationships. There is constant conflict and tension everywhere, and even like a one person isn't like a one set of person, but they have their own fragmentary identities. And even like, again, you mentioned the aesthetic briefly, but obviously the aesthetic is absolutely crazy with these very steep angles when the camera is like pointing and we only see a head of a person, and things like when you usually would see like a whole body of a person, but here you see only head, and then sometimes the heads are placed in a like a weird corner instead of the center of the shot. This is always something that I talk about when I talk about Yoshida because the aesthetic is a bit more easy to explain than the themes. And
Mhm.
there are these brilliant shots, like for example, again the young woman, and when we see her head, and then the hair is all around her. And
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
even in this booklet there was that shot. It's just incredibly beautiful shot. Like if I can find it here, yeah, here it is. So yeah, this one.
Oh yes, yes, that's an amazing shot.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's like a perfect
Yeah.
photograph basically that you could
Yeah.
put
Yeah.
in art gallery. It's just so beautiful. This is the type of shots that I
Mhm.
love. And I was also gonna mention that, of course, people might remember that back in, I think, was it February or early March, we talked about Godard's La
Mhm. Yeah.
Chinois. And
Yeah.
obviously, I think Godard is probably one reference point that people could make. And I think there's this, again, like I talked about, this conflict and infighting between like radical individuals and stuff. And that's the same in La Chinois when there's the scene where they mention that I ran into these other communists and they beat me up or something like that. Even though they're both communists, they have similar ideas, but there are still conflict between them as they're all different individuals. They have weird relationships together. Everything is so fragmentary. So yeah,
Mhm.
and of course Japan is known for very strong kind of order and social cohesion. So it's very interesting to, I guess,
Mhm.
he kind of deconstructs Japanese society in a way and turns it on its head. That usually we think of order and cohesion, but here it's the complete opposite. It's all radicalism, it's all weird, and everything is going against conventions and social norms. And of course, many of these um, radical student movements and these things like that were going against it. And Japan has like history of political radicalism. Like they have had their own branch of anarchists, and obviously Yukio Mishima was a far right radical. Again, around this time, I think he committed
Mhm.
harakiri. Was it maybe a bit before this film
Mhm.
came out? Was it in the
Mhm.
60s? Maybe. So obviously there is a long history of that type of thing. And even in older Japanese films, we see these different clashes. Obviously, in Osu films, it's a very mild version of different kind of conflicts between ideas and tradition and modernity. And then, obviously, in a film like Sancho the Bailiff, we have conflicts between like morals and again morality, immorality, again society, individual, and things like that. So these are running themes in Japanese cinema, but here it's just everything is turned up to the 11, and all tradition has been torn away from the style of the film, and everything is radical and weird and different. And I think the name of the trilogy actually talks about this film quite well, Love and Anarchism, because we
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
this
Yeah. Yeah.
anarchist style, we have radical politics, and we have a bit of an exploration of love and relationships, gender relations. And okay, like I said, there's the talk about homosexuality, and there's even this lesbian scene in the film, which is obviously very radical for 70s Japan, as it would have been even radical in the West, but especially in Japan. So yeah, it's such a crazy movie.
Yeah. It's a crazy movie, and it's as you were talking about all these things, I also started to laugh because I was remembering little things from the movie because obviously the first time when you're watching it and you're so confused, and I think this is also a misunderstanding I have, or maybe even most people have, is that if you're dealing with art house cinema, it's a very serious business. Like this is very serious. So if you watch this, oh, it's about like serious people, like having serious, like you just have this image, and then that's what makes these films even seem maybe more intimidating than they might be. They might seem more remote than they might be. But here in this film, even as you're talking about it, there's humor. And when you said Godard and Le Chinoise, I totally thought of that because there are. their relationships between the films, but all the perspective is, well, the way it's done and what level it's looking at it is different. But you have this Ambassador M character. I think it's Ambassador M, right? Or it's like this ambassador character from China kind of coming in and then bringing this Marx Marxism or communism into the country, and he's quite like it's quite funny. Even as you're describing it, it's hard to describe why it's funny, but it is sitting there talking about how these movements, and there's that in Le Chinoise as well, is that how these movements take themselves very seriously, and this is a way to break down that taking yourself very seriously, like you're doing something very important, like you're gonna change history, you're gonna save humanity, you're gonna fix this society, you're gonna make everyone right, you're gonna make the people you think are disenfranchised enfranchised, you're gonna do all these big lofty things, and then yet you're not really doing anything because you're stuck in the same, and that's where the mirror or doppelganger, the mirroring thing is going on, because as you watch this film, you don't really know the line between the status quo and the anarchic movements. They almost go back and forth, and there's this weird chase where they're trying to figure out, well, who was the secret agent and who betrayed whom, and they're just wrapped up in this, and then it's flipping back and forth between scenes where it's the establishment doing that, and then scenes of the leadership in the movements that are doing that, to the point where the whole reality becomes so blurred, and you're like, where am I? Am I on this side or am I on that side? And to me it felt like that is some of what is going on, to show that you're taking yourself so seriously to the point that you're defining yourself against the other, and you're saying, I have nothing in common with this, but you have everything in common with this because you're a human being. And as a human being, we have these vulnerabilities. Uh, we have these needs, and then on top of that, uh, it's you also have something in common because it's a system. Whether it's this, whether it's that, it's a system. And then the system is going to have politics, and it's going to have bureaucracies, and then it's going to have insanity, like in the form of this constant search for fidelity versus infidelity. Who's betraying whom? Who's in this paranoia? Someone's going to betray us, and then they're going to betray. Are they betraying the cause? Are they the secret agent? Are they the double agent? And this obsession with that constantly in the film, to the point of insanity and farce and satire that it's kind of meant to evoke. It also makes you think about how today, with these movements, we've forgotten that angle of looking at these things. Like, we look at each movement and we're like, we're really, really serious. And I think Yoshida in this at least feels to me like he's breaking that down and saying, you got to look at it differently. Sometimes we're very self-serious and we really think we're going to do this big thing that's going to change everything, and we're not going to change anything. We might even make it worse, or we may give cycles to more repression, more oppression, more violence, more breakdown of things that actually bind humanity, such as love.
Yeah, and what kind of relates to many of the points that you were making is that I was reading a letterbox review of this film that analyzed the film, that it's about like the failures of radicalism and these big ideas that, like we see here, that all these people, okay, they are like in a purgatory. They have destroyed psyches, they have big ideas, but they don't know how to make those ideas into reality. And of course, that can destroy your psyche when you cannot kind of express your ideas, you cannot make them true. They are all utopian, even though you think they are great ideas, something that we should strive for, but then they just aren't um, possible to come to fruition or make them come to fruition. And I think that's a battle with many of us, and this may be a point that many people can relate to that. Of course, we all have ideas on how to make the world a better place, and I have many ideas without going into the specifics that I would like to see a very different world than it is now. But at the same time, I realize that, yeah, it's not going to happen due to many
Mm.
negative forces in the world and many very rigid way of thinking from many people and many politicians. And that can really alienate you from society. It can really hurt you mentally when you can see these ways to how to make the world a better place, but then they just will never come to
Mm.
fruition, and you just have to live with that. And then you feel like a zombie in a purgatory like world where you're just moving from place to place in a very weird and anarchic way. Your life doesn't really make sense,
Mm.
and all of these have like the your psychology, your individuality always comes to clash with society and other people. I think that's a big thing in this film, like I talked about before.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. Actually, it's making. I'm thinking about the things in the film right now based on what you said. That lens, and I can see it. Yeah, I can see it, and the idea of this kind of heroism where I have now the right answer, and I'm gonna lead this thing, or even martyrdom, in a way, just creating another purgatory for the world because you create these constructed heroes and these constructed battles or these, like you said, utopias and ideals, and we're going to accomplish this, and we don't really think about the damage we cause in the process and the damage that it's going to cause in the future. And that child like represents that. Like Jay's clearly being constantly harmed through that whole film, and it's almost like that is bringing the human element where it's like, don't you see the damage? But in addition to that, there's also that interesting thing that when you say about La Chinoise, which is these revolutionary couples, that was is also an interesting exploration in this film too. That how love works within such a construct. What is the definition of love really? What is the love based on? Because it seems to be very functional. The love is based on the fact that you have fidelity to the movement, and if you don't have fidelity to the movement, it's almost like you have infidelity in marriage, infidelity as a parent, infidelity like sexually. Like it's like the movement is everything, and infidelity to the movement means an infidelity of everything. And I think it's that somehow seems to tie with what you're saying in terms of this very simplistic way of approaching the world's problems or societal's problems or the issues with systems, and just plain opposing them. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll add to what I was also going to say before is that I think this film has a very theatrical quality in a way, and one word that comes to my mind from it is illusion.
Mm,
And I was actually started thinking about the Mulholland Drive scene
mm,
when the two women are in the theater and there's the silencio, no hi panda, it's an all on illusion. I
yeah.
started thinking about that and the connection of this film to something like that. Like there's that scene, I think it's near the end, where we see a dead body in this kind of like an
Mm,
alley way, and then there's like the main male character, and he's standing in the center of the shot, and then there's like this garage door
mm.
goes like
Ah,
this now,
yes,
kind of like
yes,
in the theater, like you see the drapes coming like
yes,
this. The curtains is the right word,
yeah,
I think.
yeah.
Yeah, and so that kind of gives it a very illusion like way that it maybe it's just a play, maybe it's all a performance, and it gives that not like an additional psychological layer to the film, that illusion aspect. And again, as this film has such a fragmentary style to it and such a, again, identity crisis and everything like this. So maybe these characters are so psychologically damaged that they cannot even themselves like realize what is reality, what is not reality, what is hallucination, what is the illusion there, and what is not. So yeah, so many things.
Yeah, I think I mean, I think you're right on there. Like as you're saying that, I'm like, yeah, you're right on, because the whole aesthetic, and then this is the other part that's very difficult to talk about in the film, because everything we're talking about in terms of narratives or plot points or things that are happening are 100% woven and tied 100% with the aesthetic. So you're right, this quality of illusion, or etherealness as well, like it's there because it's like the overexposed, uh like the overexposed camera, so that this way where it's like they're not really fixed, they're not concrete enough. And in some ways there's this juxtaposition, because you have these very man-made construct or person-made constructed elements, okay, buildings and concrete, and they are taking up majority of the frame, and people are like relegated to like small pockets under, like they're almost suffocating. So there's this weightiness, and then there's also a very nice contrast, like you're saying, of like what it seems to be much more solid and concrete, and then what seems to be, like you said, illusory. And you see that, and it gets played with, like with these scenes with the garage doors like going up, and there'll be a blinding light, and the character will completely disappear because the light is too bright, and now you can no more see the form of the person, or it coming down, and then that like revealing something, or they going across different backdrops, like they'll be on a white backdrop, then they'll move to a black backdrop. You see them, you don't see them. And I definitely felt that in the whole film from the beginning, that I was like, there is this uh, thing going on, that it's like kind of made in a way that falsely would make you think, oh, this is a very realistic, almost documentary, but except for the exposure, that's now starts creating the surrealism in realism, and there's this very strict geometry everywhere and constraints, and so concreteness, and then yet the way it's shot and everything is very elusive. You can't quite grasp it. So then it's very much surreal, or illusory, like you said, or ethereal. It can just float away. The person can come, the person can go, and then that's very much tied to, I think, the spirituality in the film, which is, we're talking about souls here. We're talking about human suffering. We're talking about cycles of the human experience. Um, yeah, I can totally see what you're saying about that. The whole illusion. You do feel like what's real, what's an illusion. Um,
To go back to free jazz once again, I think we
mm,
often call that type of music ordered chaos,
mm,
and that I think that expression fits a film like this as well. Like we talked about, that there is certain ways how it is ordered, how it is very meticulous, but at the same time there's the illusion dream element. So there's this contrast between order and chaos, and obviously that's kind of what the word purgatory like makes you think as well. It's not heaven, it's not hell, it's something in between. It has different elements to it. But I think if we think about the name of this film, like what does the name of the film say? Heroic purgatory. Like how is it
mm,
heroic? Like does
yeah.
that title make any sense? Are these people, these radicals, heroic, that
Mm,
they are kind of fighting a losing battle? They are trying to make a big change in a
mm-hmm,
world that is ordered in some way. They are trying to use their free will against a determinist world. It's not gonna work. But that attempt at the same time is kind of heroic and maybe virtuous in a some way. But at the same time, again, it's all chaos. It's all fragments. It's all
yes.
brutalist. So
Yes, 100%. You know, are they acting heroically? What is heroic? What is heroism? And the theme, obviously there's the mother-daughter theme, but there's also the father-daughter theme is also there, and these daughters saying, like these kind of almost doppelgangers of each other. There's the Ayu, and then there's that other revolutionary girl who then says, well, yeah, I was sold into the revolution into a young age. That's a very curious, I don't know about translation, but it's Tony Raines who's done the translation for this film. He's done the subtitles, so I'm thinking it's probably very, very, very good. So I'll take it as literate that I was sold into the revolution. What does it mean? I mean, that's clearly a failure of a father to protect his daughter if she can be sold into something. Means she has no family, she just only has this. And how's that heroic? So you're absolutely right. Or when you have to, I don't know, abandon a loved one and let them, I don't know, be killed under false pretenses. What's heroic about that? So I think it's there's a lot of that. There's a lot of questioning. It's a thing full of questions. And as you're saying, talking about free jazz and bringing that in, I think that brings it back to who would be who would is would you recommend this film to? Well, I also feel like if you want to free your mind, and I feel like you need to, just like free jazz does or anything that sits there and says, okay, we like to think in very concrete, structured ways. It's this, it's that, it's that. But it's really not like that. And you need at least moments of that where those things go away and those lines are blurred and you're no longer having the constraints to guide you, and you're asking a larger question without putting constraint on the question, for you to feel a sense of at least you're being freed a little bit from the constraints and your mind is allowed to wander a bit. But like you said, then there's the other part of the title, which is purgatory. Is there any true mental, emotional, spiritual, systematic freedom? Is there any kind of freedom that can exist, or is it a world of constraints? And once again, the imagery of constraint is always there. Constraint, restraint, and all this kind of stuff. It's always there, or it's manufactured by having physical objects take up so much of the space and the person being relegated to weird pockets or just having their head. And these are all ways of like almost separating like mind and body and soul. Like it's like the fragmentedness, the aspect where you're just kind of lost and you're just floating and you're not really a whole, and what is the whole actually is, what it is, what does it represent, kind of thing.
and what does it say about like human consciousness as well? How we still even in 2024 don't really understand consciousness fully, like what it truly is, and how much of how big is the unconscious part of our brain. Obviously, that's a main topic in psychoanalysis, for example, that we have these hidden desires, these hidden parts to ourselves that are part of us, but we cannot access them in a direct way. We can try to attempt to analyze them, but we cannot get an access to it. And that kind of relates to the part of this film as well, that maybe the conscious part of us is like very attached to social norms and ways of what people do in a society. But then the unconscious part of our brains is the more radical, freer part that like would go against all those conventions and would be truly individual, but we cannot fully accept it, like get attached to it. But there is this conflict, this fragmentary conflict there, that there is the unconscious, there is the conscious, there's the society and the individual, and you can only be consciously, your conscious part can be attached to the society, but your unconscious might be wishing for something else. Like we talked about, for example, in modern world, that we have to work all the time, and our kind of interests are determined by what other people are interested in. So millions of people are interested in Taylor Swift, so I'm gonna be interested in Taylor Swift because they are interested in it. And because our lives are so determined, we cannot really access our true desires because we don't have the time for it. Because everything else takes our time, and our kind of our whole brain capacity goes to the work and what is expected of you, and you can never get to your true desires and stuff. Like I mentioned Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School thinker earlier, and that's kind of along the lines of what he was talking about in his work in the late 50s and 60s as well. So those ideas are really hard to kind of put into words, but I've found this type of topic like very interesting. I think this maybe would fall under social psychology and stuff like that, where we can talk about the political dimension and psychology. So obviously, like Freud wrote the Civilization and its discontents, which I haven't read yet, but it's on my reading list, and I think that's kind of example of thinking about the society and the ego and the individual like together, which is like very fascinating to me and something that I want to kind of do reading about in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you've expressed it so well. You're saying like they're difficult to articulate these concepts, but you've articulate them like extremely well. And yes, and I almost feel like since that's the case, when are you not yet a fully socialized animal? When you're a child. So in this film, you have this child that's going through the process of this world of adults, not fully socialized, and connected to another more core reality, maybe, with its vulnerabilities, with its need for freedom, with its need for love. And in addition, love being in some ways, pure love being an unsocialized thing, and it exists on its own terms, and it's meant to break any system in a way that comes in its way. Love being the free flowing, amorphous entity, and the chaos in a way, because with all this order, love is the chaos, and makes sense in some ways, at least to my mind, because it's 1970 and the whole movements, counterculture movements, are based on ideas of love, some being very misguided, and obviously there are films about that. But I think, yes, you're absolutely right. There's that constant conflict there. Someone looking for freedom, and that's why maybe you are in this. Maybe just the world is a purgatory because of this very reason. You can't fully be free to your own desires. You have to conform to a certain extent. Once you start conforming, you need to share symbols. So movements. So you're talking about Taylor Swift, but that can be whether it's money, whether it's an artist, whether it's a thinker, or whatever. These are common symbols that we can share, and heroes in themselves become this symbol. We're all behind this one hero, and we can see that even in religious context or any other context. There's this idea of we must have the hero, and there's that nice dialogue at the end where she gets questioned, and she's asked the question like, what is the most important part of movement? I don't know what is the exact question, and she answers love, and they're like, no, heroism, and her husband's executed as a result of that answer. I think that is a very telling moment and a very aha moment in the film. You're like, aha, I think I now see some of what's going on in this film and how interesting.
I think that would be something that many communists would, for example, say that communism is about love, and I think hippies obviously were about love as well. But one giant topic that I just came up with was also another kind of psychoanalytical thing again, I had a psychoanalysis class last year, so I learned lots of the basics there. But there's this idea of, I'm not sure what it's called in English, but primary narcissism, if I kind of
Oh,
translate it directly from Finnish to English. But it's the time when you are a baby, and
oh yeah,
like that,
okay.
yeah. So Winnicott and Freud, for example, talk that when you are a baby, you think that you are a god. If you
Yeah.
get like a care from your mother, because like when you are hungry, your mother always comes at the right
That's
time and
true.
feeds you and things like that. So the baby kind of thinks that like he has some, or he or she has some like magical power that their mother comes.
Mm.
So they get their like needs taken care of when they want them to get taken care of. But then as they grow a little older, they start noticing that, oh, it doesn't work that way. Well, that I'm really hungry, but my mother doesn't come to feed me immediately. So then the baby kind of grows out of that type of narcissism, whatever that type of narcissism again is called in English. Again, in Finnish, it's like primary narcissism. And so, yeah, in this film, again, these people have these big ideas and they think that they can use their free will to change the world,
Oh,
but the
wow.
world is determinist and you cannot change it. But at first, you think like that baby, that you are a god. You can change the world. You have that
Oh,
youthful
wow.
naivety, but then it doesn't work out in the end because you are just an just an individual and not a god, a
Wow.
divine being. So yeah,
Oh, wow. That's amazing what you're sharing. So also the heroism being tied to a sense of ego, which is true. It's an like egoic like pursuit uh, to be hero, or the idea of heroism. Uh, it's yeah, it's almost creating an illusion, like you said, like a false narrative, and almost a sense of control and a sense of destiny and sense of all these things. But that would be linear, whereas in here's the cycle. Wow, wow, that's oh, that's like that's one of the keys I think really breaks open the film. What you just said, I think that one, there are many keys I think that break open the film in different realms, but that realm, like, yeah, the ego is definitely there, and the sense of, yeah, the power, and we're going to change society, this egoistic pursuit, and it's going to be great for everyone, and everyone's going to be okay, and in the process you're hurting everybody, and the future will not necessarily be better than the past. But now it's like, yeah, you'd have to watch it again, because there's that curious thing, serenity, that gets woven in when it's like 1980. And I think that's the strangest part when you go into the future, and it's hard to understand what is being kind of explored and said there, except that it stands out in this strange way. Have they become, to me, it felt like they've now become the establishment, and they're no different. Uh, and they've forgotten everything, because there is this sense of, oh, did I have a daughter? Oh, did I have, there's this obliviousness, like they've forgotten what the movement was originally about, and now they're just the establishment again. So I wonder if that also ties to your uh, egoism as well, idea.
yeah, and that reminded me of I think it's a Churchill quote that you are heartless when you're 20 if you are not a socialist, then you are stupid when you are 40 if you are not a conservative or something like that. Even though I don't agree with that
Yeah, yeah.
quote, by the way, but I just came to me in a way that when you said that, they've kind of become the establishment, and that obviously what happens in the world, that when you gain power, like before you got the power, you had these ideas, yeah, I'm gonna save the people, I'm gonna do these good things. But then when the power corrupts you and the other people in the, for example, government corrupt you, then you become the establishment itself and you become the norm when you were something radical. Before it, you kind of forget your big ideas, your previous ego, and then you transcend into another ego that's just a part of the social norms, and you become like everybody else when you were something unique before that. You were that narcissistic god, but you become just like another person after that.
I think that's really prescient of Yoshida, because if you think about it, that's at 1970, and he's looking at the 80s, and maybe he's portraying that. And we think about some of the children of the 70s, this free thinking, we're going to go to India and we're going to meditate and we're going to search, and then they come up with these ideas like Apple computers and whatnot, and then these turning into the trillion-dollar corporations that they are today, and in a way, operating in a way that's not freedom, it's back to constraining and exploitation. uh, I think that's very prescient for Yoshida to not only potentially see that, but potentially see every previous movement in the light of the current movement. Like, he's able to sit there and say, you see those previous movements? People probably thought exactly like this. And that's how we got here. So this current order, they came from a sense of revolution or change or conflict, and now they're this. And you're railing against them. And then tomorrow you'll be that. And then something will rail against you. And so we're in purgatory. We're not going anywhere. We're in the cycle, and maybe there's a way to break out of it, but it's not within everything we're looking at. It has to exist in a dimension outside of all this, I guess, heroism, like you say, that the narcissism, that primary narcissism, that egoism. It has to exist outside of that. And what breaks the ego in a spiritual sense? It's love, right? At the heart of Buddhism or spiritual practice, it's love, but not the kind of love that's, well, what would you say, created within a system, defined by a system, or very bourgeois, man. Not that kind of love, but a kind of something, like you're saying, coming elemental from your free spirit love, that you have this capacity inside, and then you're not able to tune into that capacity because society won't let you either. Which is, I mean, that's profound. When you think about what the experience of the film is, and then you realize all this is woven in and happening, is just mind blowing, actually.
This kind of reminds me of like one joke that I sometimes make about this very popular band called Rage Against the Machine.
Oh yeah,
That
Raging Against the Machine.
people probably have at least heard of. So obviously in the beginning they made their famous record where they go against the government and lots of things, but then they become a huge band, millionaires, part of the establishment. So then Rage Against the Machine is actually Rage for the Machine, or Rage in favor of the machine. When you become a
Ooh.
millionaire establishment band, like one of the most famous bands in the world, so then the radicalism starts to go away when that happens, and you kind of can become a sellout. After that, I'm not necessarily saying that they did that, but I think you can make that kind of wordplay with their name and with these ideas. So.
Yeah, like Love and Peace. Love and Peace. Wherever.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, he's a revolutionary, he's anti-government. What is really becomes a pop artist, yeah. Well, there's a quote from one of your favorite filmmakers, Christopher Nolan, in The Dark Knight, in the script, where it says, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself turn into the villain. So I think that's kind of
And
apt
Batman is
there
the
to,
villain in those films. So, yeah.
yeah, so it's like
I mean, he's
that.
the conservative fascist, basically. So, yeah.
Yeah, and in one way, whatever you're trying to, I think that's it. Like, that egoism, it is breaking that for sure. This film, it's that, don't be so naive to think that you're so pure that your ideas or your systems or your whatever are not going to turn around and run the risk of the same problems, or creating the same conflicts, or creating the same violence, or creating the same hurt like previous movements. And if you do that, maybe it's a bit hopeful too. And if you can be so aware, maybe you have a hope of remotely doing something that makes a little more, I won't say sense. Again, that's an intellectual idea. It's hard to captivate, but I feel like it does seem like this film is saying, be aware, you know, don't just assume. But we can't help it, so we're trapped, I think. So there is that other side of it in there. The purgatory. You are trapped by this. You can't help it. Like, people just keep doing this. Um, so I don't know. It's like both hopeful and cynical all at once. And obviously, it has no time. It goes from back to future to present. It's 1952 to 1980. It's like time jumping. It's and then there are confrontations of characters with themselves, and then there are characters and then alternate versions of the same character and all that. So I think there's all that as well, complexity. But yeah, I do agree with you that these are some of the themes, very interesting themes.
Yeah, we can maybe end it with a more hopeful note, like you mentioned the word hopeful, that you can, I think, read this film in a more hopeful way. Maybe it's just a call for people being more self-aware, like that. Yeah, your ideas, maybe they seem good to you, moral to you, but there will always be flaws to them, and you won't be a pure person. There is always impurity and immorality to every single person. And it's good to be self-aware about that. It's good to acknowledge those things. And when you actually are very self-aware and acknowledge those more negative things, you can escape that fragmentary nature of your being. Yeah.
Yep, I agree with that. Yes, it's a good note.
And it's funny that I think this might be our longest conversation. So, yeah, we were very afraid about this film, but it ended up being like 70 minutes. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was a really good discussion. It always helps me to hear you phrase certain things, and then I start, oh, okay. I start seeing some things, and okay, yeah, I get that. Yeah, I saw that thread. So wow, I mean, this makes you actually want to watch it again because of this, because it's enriching. It's one of these. I do, like you said, there's no spoiling this movie. So in a way, some pre-discussion, actually watch it, struggle with it, then maybe like this, have a discussion, watch a discussion, then go back, and I'm sure there's reveal much more. But yes, thank you. Great recommendation.
Yeah, I'm
As
glad
always.
you got lots out of it, and I'm glad that our discussion ended up being again better than expected. I'm glad that we were able to analyze it, whether our analysis is good or not. At least we came up with lots of different ideas, and I feel like I now understand better why I love this film and why it's such a brilliant film, and there are as many psychological layers as there are political layers, and which is very good because I'm very much interested in both of those things. So
Yeah.
so it's good to have a nice combination, and I think the best films of all time usually have these different layers and lenses of that you can watch them through. And like I said earlier, we are gonna return to Yoshida in the future with Eros Plus Massacre and possibly other films as well, and hopefully Radiance, for example. Again, they put out a story written with water, and hopefully they will put out more of his stuff as well, because he has made many great films. Like there is one favorite of his that I have seen that isn't available on physical media called Confessions Among Actresses, which is a really weird film. So hopefully that will get released or maybe come to like official streaming or something, but we'll see. But Aerospace Massacre will be the one that we will do maybe later in the year, so we'll see.
Absolutely, that'll be great.
And then in the next episode, we're going to talk about Hou Xiaoshen's Millennium Mambo, which is actually similar to this film as it is very fragmentary and about alienation and things like that. But anyway, thanks for watching this episode. hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you will watch this film if you haven't. And hope you are well. Thanks for watching. Don't drink Coke at all. Sayonara and arigato gozaimashita.